Top legal tips every podcaster needs to know. Well, it happens to podcasters more often than you'd think. Podcasters get sued, DMCA takedown notices, and all kinds of other flavors of legal hot water. And it's not just about when they use music, although that's common. There are a ton of legal considerations you need to know before you hit that record button. And today we are going to jump into that and dive into the top legal tips every new podcaster needs to know to keep their show safe and sound. So stay tuned. Welcome to Legit Podcast Pro. I'm your host, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. And whether you're a seasoned podcaster or just getting started in this fun new medium, understanding the legal aspects of podcasting really is crucial. Ignoring these things can lead to costly mistakes, and nobody wants that. In today's episode, we're covering the top legal tips every new podcaster needs to know. So let's just get started. First things first, let's talk about choosing a podcast name. It might seem simple, but there's a lot more to it than just picking something catchy and running with it. You need to make sure that the name you choose isn't already in use. And this is where doing some searching is really important. Start by doing a basic search on Google and on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and on social media platforms and see if the name is maybe already taken. If you find a match, the best practice, you have to choose a different name to avoid potential legal issues. Even if you don't find an exact match, consider names that are similar to yours to be a red flag of warning. The risk is about whether there's a likelihood of confusion. That's the standard in trademark infringement cases. The bottom line is you don't want there to be that likelihood of confusion among listeners or risking the trademark infringement claim itself. It's also a good idea to make sure that the .com domain for your chosen title is available and grab it when you can. If it's not, that will make it harder for folks to discover and locate your show. So again, consider this kind of thing before locking in your title. And to be absolutely certain, you can search the United States Patent and Trademark Office website. They have a search functionality. And you can also run a more comprehensive trademark search using a third-party service. And it's really a good idea at this point to consult with a trademark attorney to ensure that the name you're choosing is clear and can be legally protected. In fact, I just recently helped a client who's been podcasting for a while deal with a situation where another podcaster who had sort of beaten her into the market with a similar, not an identical, but a similar name and had registered the trademark was in a position to force my client to change up the title of her show. And as it happened, it worked out nicely because it was a good time to rebrand, and the show itself and the content had sort of pivoted away from where it had been originally. So it worked out fine. But the point being, there was some cost and expense associated with that. Choose your titles carefully and register the trademark for your title. That's a very, very good idea. And if you would like to know more about that and maybe schedule a consultation, please visit firemark.com/trademarks. Now let's talk about copyright and other kinds of intellectual property. As a podcaster, you need to understand these laws to avoid infringing on someone else's work. Copyright protects original works of authorship, music, literature, and podcasts. It is automatic. So a creator owns a copyright the moment they create their work. Using copyrighted material without permission from the owner is infringement, and it'll lead to legal trouble. This is the same whether it's music or sound effects or clips or images or whatever from other sources and other places. Always do your best to create original content or get the proper permissions and licenses to use any copyrighted material you want in your show. For music, obtaining the appropriate license really is crucial. You'll need to negotiate directly with two parties because there's two copyrights to think about, the composition and the recording. So you deal with the music publisher or the songwriter directly if it's an indie artist, and that covers what are called the synchronization rights, which allow you to use the musical composition in your podcast. It's synchronized with the other content that you're using in the show. And additionally, you need to secure master use rights from the record company or the actual artist who recorded the song. ASCAP and BMI and other performance rights organizations, we hear their names thrown around quite a lot, but actually they only handle public performance rights, and that doesn't cover the synchronization or the master use rights that are needed for podcasts. So it's actually easier and cleaner to just deal directly with the owners, who can also give you those performance rights, rather than patching things together with these organizations as well. Consider using royalty-free or Creative Commons licensed music as an alternative. It's much more cost-effective and much less hassle. Just make sure that you understand the terms of that Creative Commons license, or whatever terms the music library you might be using will have in place. My favorite source for music is a subscription service, a library with a really diverse and useful catalog of music genres, styles, and grooves, and lots of good sound effects in their library too. It's called Epidemic Sound, and I am going to put a link in the show notes, and it's not an affiliate link or anything. It's just, I like them. I think they're good. Please go use them. All right. Speaking of licenses, let's dive deeper into licensing agreements. Licensing is crucial when you're using someone else's content, whether it's that music or other things. Lots of different kinds of licenses you need depending on what the content is. As I mentioned, for music, you need a synchronization license to use the composition and a master use license for the recording. You negotiate these directly with the publisher and the label. And that process can sometimes be costly, but it is necessary. Otherwise, you can find yourself in some real legal hot water. And if you're using sound effects or other audio clips, like from movies or what have you, ensure that you have the appropriate licenses and permissions there too. There are lots of libraries where you can buy sound effects and music, but always read and understand the terms of those agreements. And if you're doing video, the same approach is applicable for video, film, photos, anything like that. Using stock images is a great way to go, or stock footage is good. Again, check those licenses. But if you're going to use something from a feature film or a television show, it's important to identify and negotiate terms with the owner, unless the fair use defense applies. That's a subject for another video, but very quickly, if you're doing criticism and commentary like a movie review show or something, you might be in fair use territory, and that's something to explore. You can check out my video on fair use by going to firemark.com/fair use. All right. Privacy and consent are the next critical aspects of podcasting law that I want to talk to you about. If you are interviewing guests or discussing sensitive topics, these are important. Always, always, always obtain consent from your guests before recording. Think of it like safe sex. Use one every time or else. This could be as simple as a verbal agreement, but that risks not getting all of the necessary points into the discussion. So it's really best to have a written release, a form that outlines the terms of their participation. That release form should include irrevocable and unconditional permission to record the interview and use their voice and likeness, and to distribute your content across all of the various platforms in any media forever and ever, in perpetuity. It's also a great idea and important to include a clause that releases you from any claims or liabilities that arise from the recording and the publication of the content, and specify that the podcaster is the sole owner of the copyright in the episode material created with the guest. Now, I've created a free podcast guest release that you can get just by visiting podcastrelease.com. Provide me an email address, and we're off to the races. You'll get access to a form and template that you can use, plug it into an online form for booking guests on your show, or send it by email, or use those digital signature services. All of those work great. Now, while we're talking about privacy, it's also really important when we're talking about sensitive information about anyone at all, that you're mindful of the privacy laws. Avoid sharing personal information that isn't already public without consent, and be aware of the legal implications when you disclose private facts about people. If you're unsure, it is always best to consult with a lawyer to ensure that you are compliant with the privacy laws. Now, next up, let's talk about sponsorship and advertising. If you're planning to monetize your podcast with sponsorships or ads, there are a bunch of legal considerations to keep in mind. First and foremost, you have to understand the U.S. Federal Trade Commission's guidelines on endorsements and testimonials. The FTC requires clear, conspicuous disclosure of any material connection between you and the sponsor. Yes, a payment is a financial connection, a material financial connection. That means you have to disclose if you're being paid to promote a product or a service, or if you received something of value for free. Say you're doing an unboxing or a product review and they sent you the stuff to look at. Disclosure should be easy to understand and hard to miss in the same medium that you're using. So if you're doing audio, you need to say it audibly. If you're on video, you also need to put a disclaimer of some sort on the screen generally. Now, these disclosures, like I said, need to be easy to understand, and you should also include them in your show notes. When you're entering into sponsorship agreements, make sure you have a written contract that outlines the terms of the deal. This should also include the payment terms, the duration of the sponsorship, the kind of content you're creating, and any exclusivity clauses. Having a clear contract helps protect both you and the sponsor. Next up is libel and defamation. These are serious issues that every podcaster needs to think about. Libel is a false statement about a person that's published and that causes harm to their reputation or their standing in their community. Now, defamation is the broader umbrella term that includes both libel, which is written, recorded, printed, published, transmitted kind of content, and slander, which is the version we talk about when it's a spoken word statement made in a small group setting or something like that. So to avoid these kinds of claims, always fact check your content. Ensure that any statements you or your guests might make about individuals or companies are true and can be substantiated, preferably with 2 or more reliable, credible sources. Avoid making derogatory, unverified claims, and be really careful if you're talking about controversial subjects. That's an easy way to paint a target on your back. Now remember, even if you're expressing your opinion, it should be based on verifiable facts. Statements of opinion that imply false facts could still be considered defamatory. Now, if you're unsure about the legal implications of your content, it might be a good idea to get a lawyer to review it before you publish, just to make sure. Now, let's discuss the business side of podcasting. Choosing the right structure for your podcast could have significant legal and tax implications. Now, the most common structures that we see podcasters use are sole proprietorships, partnerships, limited liability companies, and corporations. A sole proprietorship is the simplest structure, but it offers zero liability protection for the owner. Effectively, you and the business are legally one and the same, and you're liable personally for anything that might go wrong. A partnership is similar, but it involves 2 or more people, and each partner is individually liable for everything that happens in the business, even if one of the other partners is who's really at fault. The LLC, limited liability company, provides liability protection along with a few other benefits, and it's relatively easy to set up and operate. And a corporation offers the most protection, but it is a little more complex and it requires some more administrative work. Now, each of these structures has different tax implications as well, so it's important to consult with a lawyer and maybe with your tax advisor to determine which is going to be best for your situation. Regardless of the structure you choose, it's essential that you keep your personal and your business finances separate. Open a separate bank account for your podcast's income and expenses, and keep detailed records for tax purposes. Contracts and agreements are vital for protecting your podcast and establishing clear terms with collaborators. There are lots of different kinds of these contracts that you might want to consider. There's the guest agreements that we've already talked about, co-host agreements, which are agreements that lay out the relationship of you and your co-host. It outlines the roles and responsibilities and revenue sharing arrangements and so on. Co-production agreements can act as your podcast prenup when you're sharing the ownership and responsibilities, control, and profits with a collaborator. And as I mentioned before, sponsorship agreements should detail with solid language the specific, precise terms of the sponsorship deal. Really, everybody who has a hand in the making of your show, even down to the most casual independent contract worker, whether it's an editor, a researcher, a production assistant, you get the picture. They should have a written contract so it's clear who owns what, what's expected of everybody, and what they can expect for themselves. Always have written agreements in place to avoid these misunderstandings that can lead to real problems and to protect your interest. If you're not sure what to include, consult with a lawyer or check out the forms and templates we have over in the store at podcastlawforms.com. Now, the distribution end of things is another important aspect of podcasting. And long story short, it's important to understand all of the terms of service for the platforms and online tools that you are using. When you distribute through Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google, you agree to their terms of service. And these can often include important clauses about your intellectual property rights, content restrictions, who's responsible or liable for things. It really is important to read and understand these things. They may not be negotiable, but it will open your eyes as to what you need to be thinking about. And protect your rights when you're using these kind of platforms by making sure you retain ownership of your content and you understand how the platform is allowed to use and allow others to use your content. Now, before we wrap up, I want to address a few of the common legal questions and misconceptions that I hear from new podcasters. Number one is, do I need a lawyer to start a podcast? And the answer is no, you don't. While you don't necessarily need a lawyer, consulting one can help you navigate the legal aspects and avoid potential pitfalls. Lawyers can help with trademark searches, drafting documents, and ensuring that you're compliant with copyright and privacy laws. Or you can do it yourself, especially if you have the kinds of tools and resources and templates that we have available at podcastlawforms.com or inside my course, Easy Legal for Podcasters. You can find out more about that over at easylegalforpodcasters.com. Question number two is, can't I use any music in my podcast if I'm not making money from the show, as long as I credit the artist? Well, no, crediting the artist isn't enough to legally use the music. You need to obtain the appropriate licenses to use copyrighted material in your podcast. That includes the synchronization license for the composition that you negotiate with the music publisher and master use licenses that you negotiate with the record label. The third common question is just, how do I protect myself? And the short answer is, heed the advice I've given you here today. But copyright actually will protect your content the same way it protects others. So you can avoid problems with copying just by understanding that and being vigilant to chase down anybody who lifts pieces of your show without your permission. Registration of your copyright with the U.S. Copyright Office, that's copyright.gov, provides additional legal benefits. It makes it easier to enforce your rights if someone copies your content. And it may be the difference between getting your attorney's fees paid or having to foot the bill yourself if you have to sue somebody. And registering your title as a trademark, if it qualifies, very smart move. That'll help you prevent other podcasters from adopting names that are too similar or could cause confusion between your show and theirs. So that's it for today's episode of Legit Podcast Pro. We've covered a lot of ground, from choosing a podcast title, understanding copyright laws, securing licenses, getting consent, navigating business structures and taxes. So remember, taking the time to understand these legal aspects can really save you from costly mistakes and help you to build a successful show. If you have any legal questions or you want more resources, check out podcastlawforms.com, where you'll find a range of podcast-specific lawyer-generated legal forms and templates to help you establish solid business relationships and protocols, build your team structures, and set up monetization deals and more. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and please tell your friends, share this episode with other creators. And for more of our valuable insights, I have a video for you. It's called Level Up Your Podcast Success. Level Up Your Podcast Success. Essential Frameworks for Podcast Creators. It's on YouTube, but you can go to GPF, those are my initials, Gordon P. Firemark, gpf.link/level-up. And that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. Please join me again next time as we explore more tips and strategies that'll help you succeed in the world of podcasting. And until then, happy podcasting.